Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Ashley is also joining me as co-host. And Chris was with us very early on in Doomer Optimism before we were actually a proper podcast, when we were still doing our pre-series. We didn't know it was a pre-series at the time on the Stoa. And your work has been very influential for me and for a lot of people in this space to kind of help us frame our thinking of things that we kind of already intuitively knew, but hadn't kind of drawn out all of the implications and all of the details. Your book, A Small Farm Future, is great. So that came out in 2020, I believe. If you haven't read that, audience, please do. But today we're talking about his new book coming out. It's coming out in July, I believe.
Yeah, June in the UK, July in the US.
So, yeah. Saying no to a farm-free future. Now, who the heck is arguing for a farm-free future? That sounds ridiculous, right? But actually, some well-heeled people, prominent columnists in the Guardian newspaper in the UK, prominent environmentalists and eco-modernists, and we'll probably define that term, George Monbiot, among others, is arguing for a farm-free future. So you might ask, where are we going to get our food, right? Well, the answer comes down to science, to precision fermentation. I'm sure that Chris will be talking more about that. But Chris, why don't we start just by giving a bit of your background? I think a lot of our audience is already kind of familiar. You've talked about it on previous podcasts, a bit of your background. And then if you could jump into, let's start with, if you were to give kind of the most sympathetic, if you were to steelman Monbiot's argument, like what is the most sympathetic reading of what he's saying? Steelman his case, and then we'll talk about, we'll try and deconstruct it. So that's kind of what we're doing on this podcast, why ultimately we don't want a farm-free future. But first, let's talk about the case for it. So I'll give it to you, Chris.
All right. Yeah. Well, hi, Jason, Ashley. Nice to be talking to you guys again. So my background, I'm a social scientist. Okay, I'm not a biotech person or an engineer or a physicist. And one of the difficulties of this whole area is that you get drawn into some pretty kind of techie stuff. Which is fine, and I've done my best to sort of get my head around that. But I think it's important to sort of keep a bigger picture sort of framing of it. And one of the problems in this area is people say, I've read a study that's come up with this number that means therefore society should do X, and I'm like, whoa, as a social scientist, you don't infer from a research study which comes up with certain numbers all the complexities of what humanity should do. But it's important to be aware of those numbers and to ground it in empirical debate. So yeah, I'm a social scientist by background. I kind of worked in research institutes and universities and so on, until till about 20 years ago, and then basically sort of cottoned on to the kind of stuff that you guys have explore so well in your podcast, agrarian localism, the climate change, energy scarcity, the kind of all of the snafus of the kind of global high energy, high capital sort of world. So basically with my wife, I bought a bit of land in Somerset, southwest England, and obviously there's an issue here about the ease for certain people of accessing land and not for other people, which is relevant to all of this. But anyway, that's what we did, and since then I have basically been running a small mixed holding market garden, growing fruit and veg predominantly for local use, which incidentally is the one form of farming that the eco-modernists, or that George is positive about in his book. So I get a clean bill of health there, but there's bigger issues. So yeah, that's what I've been doing, but increasingly realizing that people need to be producing food and fiber and well-being locally. But the bigger issues are not, I think, those practical ones so much as the politics and the economics around it. So that's kind of in recent years drawn me back into all of the talking and blogging and writing and the kind of social science framing of how do we put this into a bigger bigger socio-political picture. So yeah, I wrote the book A Small Farm Future, and then followed it up with this one that's about to be published, Saying No to a Farm-Free Future. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but anyway. So yeah, the context for that is, as you say, this kind of eco-modernist move, and particularly George Monbiot's book Regenesis. I mean, I wrote a critique nearly 10 years ago of eco-modernism and engaged very positively with George around that. He was quite a fan of that critique at that time, but he's kind of drifted more and more towards endorsing an eco-modernist position, which is basically we need to retain a high energy civilization, but not a fossil fueled one. So it's about an energy transition to renewables or nuclear power. It's about urbanism, rewilding, using biotech to solve food problems. That's the kind of core package. And yeah, so that's what I critique in the book. But in terms of steel manning it, I mean, the first part of George's book is basically a very good critique of the unmitigated disaster of modern industrial farming, the way it poisons the environment, the numerous bads that I won't dwell on here. So there's no question that we need to change the way we farm. Another aspect that he focuses on is the way that modern farming, well, in a sense, this is at the core of one of the disagreements. His view is that farming is destructive of wildlife and natural ecosystems, that we just mustn't farm. We can't farm, we're destroying nature. And it's certainly it's hard to argue that farming is not destructive of nature. When we look around the world and look at what we're doing, look at the consequences of agriculture. So we certainly need to address that. Yeah, so that's that's probably the main steel man way of looking at it. I guess the other one is that my argument, the sort of doomer optimism world, we're talking about localism, homesteading, low energy kind of systems, and I can understand the idea that that's not going to do it. It's too little too late. We live in this massively urbanized world, massive capital flows, massive energy. The only way on is up, kind of thing. That we need to solve the problems that world is causing within the structures of that world. But my argument is that that's just further that's just sort of further backing ourselves into a corner. We're not going to solve it by doing more of the same, even if the innovations we're trying are, we're trying to sort of limit some of the damaging aspects of that high energy, high capital world. But that, we're not going to do it with the same mindset, the same sorts of techniques, the same sorts of geopolitical patterns and geographical residence and so on. So yeah, that in a nutshell would be it. We need to farm differently. We need to think about the natural world. We need to feed ourselves. But can we do that within the existing structures of a kind of high capital, highly interconnected, globalized, high energy, kind of urbanized world? I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, so that kind of, I think, lays the foundation for the rest of this conversation. We can kind of get into the details. Uh, I think it would be useful, and this is kind of the approach that you take in your book, of you kind of start with, you know, um, refuting Monbiot on his own terms, right? With the numbers, with the math, in a spreadsheet brained, to coin Ashley, to use Ashley's coined phrase. And then you spend the rest of the book talking about, even if it was possible, why it still wouldn't be a good idea and would lead to all kinds of other problems. So why don't we kind of take that structure of your book? So let's talk about, well, one, let's talk about the case that Monbiot's making. So he's saying that we can't do agriculture anymore because it's destructive of wildlife, and so the alternative is that we have all of these hot new technologies coming online, where we can basically make food in a vat, and apparently, according to him, it's energetically feasible and it can feed dense urban populations. I suspect he's pro urbanization, where basically maybe he'd want 90% of the world population to be in cities, maybe a few people scattered about, but not very many. And we could just make the food, using science, right? We don't need to have this extensive agriculture anymore. That's intruding on the animals, on the wildlife. So why don't we start there? What is his specific case about producing food using science, and why do you see it as unfeasible?
Before I answer that, do draw me back to that, Jason, if I go off on one, but it might be helpful just to sort of put that in a wider context. And the reason that I decided to do this book is that Monbiot, rightly, he has a critique of livestock agriculture in particular, but almost all kinds of agriculture, and a critique of kind of corporate livestock, basically, which I basically agree with. But the real danger of his book is that I think it plays into other corporate agendas. It plays into a corporate biotech agenda. It plays into a kind of eco-modernist urban agenda. It potentially downplays, sort of fossil fuels and other issues. And there are some people who've embraced, a lot of sort of more traditional environmentalists who've gone down the eco-modernist route have kind of said, I was wrong. I used to think that small scale farming or, nuclear power, the former was good, the latter is bad, but I've changed my mind. Monbiot hasn't really done that. He's kind of hedging his bets. He's saying that, all you agroecologists are misunderstanding me on, I'm not into urbanism. I support small scale farming. And I just don't think that argument can hold. He's kind of bet hedging in his intellectual positions. And that, I think, is what's dangerous. He's I don't know really how well known he is in the US or other parts of the world, but, he's been a very prominent environmentalist of the left, sort of radical green voice in the mainstream media, who very much has been a kind of opinion former of the sort of the critique of that whole kind of corporate capitalist agenda. And the problem, I think, is that his arguments are quite seductive on the surface, but they put us into another corporate agenda, which is a kind of corporate biotech food agenda, and a kind of high energy urban agenda. So various interviews of his I've watched, he says, I'm not saying that, that small scale farmers, peasant farmers should have to move, from where they are and move to the city. But, other aspects of his argument, either, things he said explicitly or what's implicit in his argument, that I think is going to be exactly the context. And that's why I feel the need to push back against it. If it was just another sort of corporate voice, it would be like, yeah, whatever, I've heard that 100 times before. But it's that kind of ambiguity and his positioning within a kind of radical left environmentalist framing that, that I think is what makes the work problematic. So yeah, just wanted to say that as a kind of context. But to move on
to add
to
a bit to the
the
context, 20 years ago, I was reading him in college as a young, pretty, at least in terms of critiques of globalization, pretty young, radically left. And so I admired him. I thought he was, I considered him one of the good guys. And now that's coming into question. But anyway, go ahead.
No, and I would just add to that too. Like, I think there is like this, there is a sub group of the left leaning, environmental leaning, or environmentally conscious group who have kind of taken this journey with Monbiot. And he's one of the figures, but there's others too who started with like a Battle in Seattle, like critique of globalism, critique of, industrial agriculture and just like industrial society, and have done a weird about face in like the last decade, where now they're the industrial society fans. And so I think part of what we're that this fundamentally doomer optimism seems to be like the holdouts of the original Battle in Seattle types, small is beautiful types. And so yeah, that we're trying to provide an alternative to those who have been sort of followed this Monbiot arc. Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, maybe we'll come on to that stuff a bit more later in the cast. I mean, it is symptomatic, I think, of these real changes in politics and some of the old kind of left-right certainties and some of the commitments of, familiar political positions are sort of melting away, and it's a really kind of mushy moment when it's hard to sort of work out, who our allies are and where we stand. But there's definitely that kind of standing for industry, standing for the machine, which kind of has its left and right wing manifestations, versus a more localist, more agrarian alternative, which also has its more left and right wing versions. And that, is something that sort of is increasingly occupying my mind. But yeah, I found myself writing in the book quite often. He's written so well about this in other writings. What the hell has gone on in this book? And and in particular, there isn't a critique of there isn't really a critique of corporate capitalism, of the kind that that has been well articulated both on the left and by conservatives in a different way, and that is really problematic. And likewise, the way in which peasant farmers and agrarians generally are positioned in that, is completely missing in his book. And he sort of comes back to it and sort of says, well, that's not what I'm talking about. But he needs to talk about it. He needs to really sort of have an intellectual grounding around where localism and where neo-agrarianism fits. Anyway, maybe we'll come on to that. The
fact that he uses
the sciencey bit,
farm-free, introduces a level of ambiguity that I don't think can be an accident.
Yeah.
So even though he hedges later and says, oh, well, actually, maybe a little bit of permaculture or agroecology here and there for the third world peasant farmers, we could allow a little bit of that. But it's always on a backtrack, right? His headline is farm free, which is, if he doesn't mean that, he better damn well qualify that statement immediately and not forcing us to hound him about it. That's crazy.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And I think there are these huge ambiguities, and it's hard to know whether they're how strategic they are, or but that's exactly right. I mean, he says some nice things about peasants and agroecology in the book, but it doesn't drive the narrative. The narrative is farm free, or largely farm free. The only other thing I was going to say, as I kind of mentioned, is that he is reasonably positive about small scale organic, or well, he's not that into organic, but into so-called agroecological vegetable growing. He talks about Ian Tolley, who's a very well known very, very successful, thoughtful grower here in the UK. what I think he doesn't realize, he kind of presents Tolly as being this kind of magician who's created this totally new sustainable veg growing system. But essentially what Tolly is doing, he does it very well, but essentially what he's doing is lay farming. He grows cover crops and green manures, he plows them in, plants vegetables, and sells them, and he does that very well, and he thinks about it very well, and he builds in a lot of nature and wildlife into it. But it's lay farming, it's organic lay farming that he's doing. And like a lot of growers like us, he doesn't really have much livestock. It's an intensive vegetable growing system. But if you put that into a sort of low energy global situation, what it is basically, peasant organic farming, where you would be using livestock if you didn't have a lot of money or a lot of machinery in the way that we tend to in wealthier countries, to be doing a sort of high value horticultural operation. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. It's not a complete, he finds a role for fruit and vegetables, but not in a not in a kind of fully specified way, I think, in terms of the kind of future we're heading to. But yeah, let's get on to the so-called precision fermentation. So this is basically, there are bacteria. It's a bacterial process. It's a hydrogen oxidizing bacteria, which originally is a soil living bacteria, but there's lots of it's very highly used in biotech in for various different applications. There's a lot of GM variants of this bacterium. I've just done the audio version of my book, and I'm not sure I've pronounced it correctly. Cupriovidus necator, I think, is the species, but somebody might correct me on that. Anyway, basically what you do is you get this bacteria, you put it in a bioreactor, so a big stainless steel vat, and that raises some questions about how many stainless steel vats do you need to feed the world. You feed it oxygen and hydrogen and various other things it needs. It produces a kind of big slurry of protein-rich biomass, and that's the basis of the food. There are some issues about its edibility for humans. It's high in nucleic acids. You have to kind of filter and purify. I mean, this is all a little bit over my head. As I say, I'm not a biotech person, but there are some questions. And again, I think there's a little bit of evasiveness in some of the industry literature where, it doesn't sort of fully specify what the what the nutritional outputs are, particularly the energetic outputs. And I have a suspicion, but I can't, I'm not saying this is the case, that's because quite a lot of the output is inedible and in fact might be best used for livestock feed, which is slightly ironic in view of George's kind of vegan anti-livestock focus. But yeah, that's basically the process. The real kind of critical thing is the feeding it of hydrogen. So where do you get the hydrogen from? That's the real sort of crunch to this. Where we get hydrogen from mostly, or 99%, I think, of hydrogen that's used industrially in the world today comes from fossil fuels. You get it from natural gas or coal. That obviously is not a route that we want to go down if we're talking about a sustainable decarbonized future. So where we get it from basically is water. We split water up into hydrogen and oxygen. But water, hydrogen and oxygen kind of like each other. They like being together in water. So to split it up requires a hell of a lot of electrical energy. So basically, this is an argument about renewable electricity. But my critique essentially is that if you think about the difficulties of decarbonizing the global energy system as it is, that is a big enough challenge, and almost all the food we're growing in the world at the moment is energized directly from the sun. The sun is this free source of low carbon energy. which we don't have to think about too much, but it's diffuse. So in order to capture the solar energy, we have to spread ourselves out in the landscape. And that's the problem from the wildlife point of view. Farming involves what Monbiot calls agricultural sprawl. The further complexity there is that so much of our farming isn't really geared to feeding us directly. There's this huge overproduction dynamic that results from the kind of economics of agriculture that Monbiot doesn't really properly get into in his book. So, that's the obvious other way to go, which points towards local agrarianism. But back to the energy, you need a hell of a lot of electricity to turn water into hydrogen and oxygen. And so a lot of this boils down ultimately to, or at least, the technical side of it boils down ultimately to, do you think we are going to have enough clean, low carbon electricity in the future, not only to power all the other things that we might want to power, heating our houses, all the other industries, transport, the whole shebang of whatever civilization we want to retain. Can we do that with clean energy? Can we cut the fossil fuels out? And remember, most of the global energy we're using at the moment is fossil energy. So we've got to get rid of all that. And then on top of that, this argument is saying we're going to be using a load of this renewable electricity to produce food. And I just think that's not realistic. And particularly it's not realistic because I think Monbiot and a lot of the other literature promoting microbial biomass, it understates the amount of energy that is needed. And that's something I talk about in the book. I don't know if we want to really get into the weeds or get into the bioreactor, as the case may be.
I want to just first say I have a visceral reaction to just hearing the details. Like, I just don't even, I'm so glad that you did this because I don't even want to know the spreadsheet level details of this process. It just grosses me out so much. And I'm glad you went through that because I know what's happening is a lot of smoke and mirrors. I just had Bill Rees on the podcast, and he's like the inventor of the ecological footprint, and he's very convinced that the low carbon energy is just so much smoke and mirrors in terms of shoddy accounting. And this kind of goes to I wrote a piece recently that's kind of just a short article, but somewhat inspired by your work, Chris, about the sort of different approaches to science that are fundamentally happening here. The one approach to science is like, traditional Enlightenment. You've got to isolate things from nature and measure them, and any kind of isolated variables, you can put them into some sort of spreadsheet and analyze those variables together. But the idea then is that you just aggregate these isolated variables, and then that tells you about a complex system. The alternative to that is a more like naturalistic approach, studying nature in context over time, sometimes and often with a human who has an embodied and memory relationship with that, place, so that they can understand how it has evolved throughout time, not in an extrapolated way from variable, points on a spreadsheet. And I really feel like this is fundamentally what's going on here. If people who have spent time on land come to a completely different conclusion than those who rely primarily on the data points of, let's just assume we can get low carbon energy. Let's just assume that the input to these vats will be carbon neutral or energy neutral or materials neutral. And they make so many accounting errors throughout the whole process. One of the most famous ones with livestock was an article that a report that came out called Livestock's Long Shadow, where they measured livestock's water use as all the rain that fell on the land that the livestock stood on. And then they issued a retraction later on, but then, all these graphics had already come out, like livestock uses this amount of water, but it's not actually using that water because the livestock is standing on the land, and the land itself has its own ecological system going on. It's not just like only the livestock is using it and it's just sort of gone or wasted. So anyways, maybe we can just talk a little bit about like just these different understandings, different approaches to understanding what you're looking at in the world.
Yeah, well, fascinating. All the things that kind of leads into so many interesting directions. I got to confess my sins, Ashley. I've got about 4 really big spreadsheets underlying some of my data presentations.
Spreadsheet. I allow the appropriate use of technology. Appropriate technology.
Ashley, I really want to get into this conversation that you're proposing here, but and I know that the spreadsheet talk grosses you out, but I think it's I personally
think it's worth going into the.
I want to get more into the details because
That's fine. I'll allow it.
I got my PhD in a spreadsheet in applied economics, so and
go ahead. Don't let me stop you. We'll go to this after. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I really so what are the key assumptions about like what is he missing specifically in terms of energy and materials? You mentioned how many steel vats we'll need. This is just one of many examples. Of course, as we know, steel is basically, made using fossil fuels at this point, right? People are trying to electrify this process, but we're nowhere near being able to do that at any scale. So that's just one example.
Yeah.
But if you were to like give some numbers in terms of like how much of the electricity energy load would be diverted towards precision fermentation, when we already know that,
right?
If you read many of the energy analysts, Richard Heinberg, for one, who we had on the podcast, just maintaining the level of electricity production, let alone say tripling it, which we would need to do if we wanted to replace fossil fuels. That's not even accounting for the liquid fuels problem or many other intermittency and everything else. Where is all of this electricity going to come from? If it's going to come from renewables, then where is all of the, where is all the copper going to come from? Where is all of the lithium going to come from? Et cetera, et cetera. This is a So go ahead.
Well, they're all really important questions, and I sort of went into that a little bit in the book, but then I sort of had a case of Ashley's critique of spreadsheet brain. I was like, no, I'm not. At one point I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to look at all the copper and the steel, but partly I got to the point where I think you only really have to look at the energy inputs into the into the bacterial process. And you're like, this isn't going to work. And then everything after that is, you can look at the steel use and the mineral. I touch on that a little bit, but possibly I should have touched on it more. But we were talking just before we went live a bit about that, where you end up, getting into some argument with some guy somewhere who thinks that, you can tweak a bit of sort of lithium and that's good. And it's like, whoa, how did we get on to talking about, improving the efficiency of lithium batteries when we were talking about livestock and peasants a couple of minutes ago. So you do have to put some limits around this, I think. But yeah, there is the transition out of fossil fuels and the availability of clean electricity is really critical to this discussion. And it's relevant that you mentioned steel, Jason, because there are industries like steel. If you think of things like steel and how vital it is, to modern life, the steel industry has very few options for decarbonisation, but to use electricity, but to use clean electricity. Farming is the one big industry that does have another option, and that other option is the sun. So unless you can make, unless you kind of have some scheme that is going to make clean electricity available orders of magnitude beyond the existing energy system, then this whole manufactured food idea is a non-starter. I think it's a non-starter. That means we have to go back to farming. We do have to think about wildlife and our impact on the world, but that's the debate we should be having. Not the manufactured food debate. So yeah, but the key thing, I think, the way I think this will pan out, or the way I hope it doesn't pan out, but the sort of the technology of choice for decarbonisation is photovoltaic panels in most parts of the world. I mean, it varies where we're talking about, but most of the projections I've seen is that PV panels are the way to go, which themselves are a pretty land intensive way of tapping energy. It's in terms of the critique of agricultural sprawl, I think the manufactured food folk are right up to a point, in the sense that you can produce the food on a slightly smaller area than you could with agricultural processes. I mean, going back to the point Ashley was making, it's important not to be making those spreadsheet mistakes with livestock and just thinking of a cow as meat, say. If you take a holistic agrarian approach, the cow fits into a wider ecology, and that's where we should be doing. And I do a little bit in the book, do some spreadsheets around that, which George doesn't do. George has almost a priori decided that small scale local agriculture can't feed the world. I think he's wrong. It can feed the world, and it will have to, because we have no other options. But yeah, the energy side of the of the manufactured route is that you will have to feed low carbon electricity into the system. In his book, George calculates that to do that and to provide enough protein for all of humanity would require about 11% of the world's existing electricity supply. I think he's wrong. I don't know where he gets that figure from. I think he gets it from some older studies that weren't really based on kind of empirical research. They were sort of playing with values from the literature. I don't know where he gets that figure from, but there was a study that I draw upon in some detail in my book, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, PNAS, which does go through in some detail, and it looks at energizing the process with PV panels, with solar electricity, and it compares it with agricultural methods, particularly soy, which is if we're talking about ways of manufacturing protein for people. And bear in mind, by the way, we're talking, mostly this is about protein, and that's only one. Obviously protein is key, but we also need calories, and producing calories out of this process is much trickier. So this is, even if this does solve food production problems in the way that it's suggesting, it's only one small part of that. It's only the protein. So I did some calculations on the basis of the PNAS study. They don't say explicitly anywhere what the energy requirement is, but you can calculate it from the sort of data presented in the study. And that comes out about 4 times more than what George is claiming. Now, I'm putting it out there. As I say, I'm not a biotech person. I'm not an engineer. I could be wrong, but I have gone. I can't tell you how many times I've gone through this calculation. I think I'm right. So it's 4 times more. So now we're talking about 40 to 50% of the global electricity supply. And that's all electricity, most of which comes from fossil fuels. So if we're decarbonizing, we're starting to talk about, basically, in order to provide all of the world's protein needs, we'd need to use pretty much all the low carbon electricity we have in the world to do that. And that's only talking about the process that is giving the bacteria the energy. We're not talking about the steel to build the bioreactors, the factories. We're not talking about building these solar farms. I think to produce the energy, to produce the protein that the US population would need, and would not that it currently consumes, but that it needs kind of biologically, which is about 50 grams a day. I think actual consumption is much higher. That would be something like 400,000 hectares of PV farms in the US. It would be about 9 million hectares globally. So that the energy involved in creating and installing that has not been figured into any of this. These facilities, the sort of rule of thumb is that they have a life of about 25 years. So having put this 9 million hectares of solar panels up, you'd then have to junk it after 25 years, build a whole bunch of new ones. So it uses less land. It uses less land than if we were growing beans or you know, having a mixed farming rotation. But the question is, you know, there's the energy question. Do we have enough energy? But there's also, you know, is that the right land use? You know, is it better to have, you know, a bigger acreage of mixed farming or, you know, agroecological approaches, or is it better to have, you know, acre after acre of panels? And that's where I think the spreadsheet brain starts to, you know, once you start getting into an argument about that and trying to sort of argue it out quantitatively, I think you're sort of losing the plot at that point. You know, this is more about, you know, what kind of world do we want? But you know, the empirical aspects of it are important, and they're also unknowable. You know, that part of this is, you know, George's view essentially is that humans and wildlife don't mix, get people out of the countryside. We've already touched on whether exactly what he is arguing there, which seems ambiguous, but certainly, I mean, Jason mentioned the 90% urbanization figure, which comes from Replanet, an organization that Monbiot is associated with. So certainly there's a kind of larger eco-modernist push here to get people out of the countryside. And I mean, you know, maybe we can talk more about that. I think that's really worrying and problematic, and is going to lead to no end of social conflict. But then there's a question, well, you know, what are all these folks going to do? I talk about that a bit in the book, you know, sort of urban employment questions, the whole sustainability. I mean, you talked about William Rees. I mean, he's just written brilliantly about the fundamental non-sustainability of large cities. And then ultimately, is that actually going to reduce the pressure on wildlife and the natural world? I mean, various studies have shown that urbanization is independently associated with nature degradation. You know, there's a whole set of assumptions here that if people are not living in the countryside, move to the city, then that reduces pressure on the countryside or on wildlife. But the evidence for that is weak, or if anything, points the other way. So, you know, there's a whole series of essentially unanswerable empirical questions about the future here, but you know, but kind of rising above that is sort of, you know, what kind of world, you know, do we want to create, and what kind of world is sustainable? And I'm not convinced that Monbiot's answers are plausible on either front.
Yeah, so maybe now we can get into your point, Ashley, and maybe I can set it up by, well, the way I would frame it and the way I teach it in my classes is the difference between reductionistic thinking and systems thinking, right? Or reductionism and synthesis, right? And it seems like what you're describing, Chris, is that he's kind of waving his hands about, okay, if, you know, we corral all of the rural residents up, you know, with or without their permission, you know, ship them off to the cities, what will that look like? Well, it makes sense in spreadsheets. You get them involved in whatever activity and, you know, smart zoning or whatever, and it kind of makes sense on the spreadsheet brain. But when you're, and also, you know, the critique about livestock, so I think we should differentiate this here, because I think this gets lost in a lot of the online discussion, is that, yeah, industrial livestock production, CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, are a horror show, and those shouldn't exist. And that's not what we're advocating for. And especially because you have to do monocropping, large-scale monocropping of soy and, you know, other things, and cut down rainforests in order to produce their feed. And then, you know, the ethical implications of, you know, of concentrated livestock is also immense. So that's not what we're talking about. But in order to get what we're talking about, you have to understand more of a systems thinking approach of how does, you know, it's not just isolated variables put together in a spreadsheet where they're all nice and separated. It's all of the interactions between these variables and the emergence level effects that come from that cannot be predicted ahead of time. And so then that takes us to, okay, so then how do we encourage kind of like, if we don't know exactly what will emerge, you know, what are the conditions for having, you know, let's just say the chance of a holistic kind of approach to these problems, right? And so if we're talking about, lay farming, for example, and we can get more into that, historically lay farming was integrating livestock with, crop production, right? Because the livestock would go in this area, and you write about this in your book. Their manure and their impacts on the land, help prepare the land for crop production, and you have this cycle. That starts sounding like a system, with many complex parts that have many sets of relationships that can't all be quantified in a spreadsheet, right? Mm-hmm. And then if we include humans in that equation of, okay, we're putting all of the humans into the city, we're segmenting them out where they need to go, again, all of the class implications, all of the violence implications of rounding up people and shipping them to the cities. You can't even begin to imagine that. But if we think about where humans, are in this picture, what humans, what does it mean to be human? What are humans living for? What does it mean to separate humans out from nature, from their ancestral environments, into a completely new modernistic environment versus humans being part of nature, being active stewards of nature, right? So anyway, I don't know if I set that up well to kind of take the direction in the direction you want to go, Ashley. Maybe you can amend that.
I would just add, I'll add, there's a couple of things here that are also just sort of swept under the rug that happen as a result of efficiency thinking or spreadsheet brain, which is that when you come to the social implications of trying to make everything the most efficient possible, there's a lot of just like hand waving away, like who is deciding these policies that we have to have a farm-free future? What does that do to all the farmers or all the smallholders who currently exist? A lot of whom in the global South are ranchers. Monbiot has no vision for like really livestock agriculture at all. The corporate control of the food supply? What could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong with that vision? Who is consenting to this world of solar panels covering the earth as opposed to just using direct sunlight to grow the food and to like to have the ecosystem move forward? Like the efficiency brain of let's collect the energy via sunlight and then transfer that into a factory. Like who is consenting to all of this? What small town wants one of these precision fermentation laboratories in their town? There's so much hand waving away about like the actual qualitative implications of what this would look like for like the society writ large, that are worth just pointing out like what this vision would look like in reality, or implementing it. Not to say that getting the small farm future will be easy to implement either. There's a lot of people who don't have those skills. But I feel like there's a lot more potential for self-determination and like a sort of, choosing this future, sort of distributed property ownership and we've talked about this before, some land held in commons, different kind of vision. But I think this is fundamentally like a once you go far enough down the rational spreadsheet brain hole, you eventually just get to what Chris was saying, like this qualitatively different visions and one of them, I think for most people, if you actually saw what it looked like in practice, you see what the inside of this factory looks like. You see a landscape covered in solar panels that have been up for 25 years and they're all shoddy and falling apart. Like nobody wants to live like that, and who's getting to make these choices? Just these corporations. So I don't know, the social aspect of it is that really frustrates me.
Yeah, I think that your last question there, who is getting to make these choices, is really critical, and the sort of monopoly corporation aspect of it. And this is where I think Monbiot, he has this vision that these Simon Fairley, our colleague, calls the product studge. It's worth reading his amazing magazine, The Land Magazine, and his review of George's book. But anyway, the studge factor is, Monbiot's vision is that these are going to be kind of small local facilities that will give communities kind of self-determination around food. I mean, to my mind, that's incredibly naive, because particularly because Monbiot has this whole narrative around cheap food, which I think is incorrect. You know, cheap food is not a good thing. You know, it's not a good thing for poor people. It's a kind of dynamic of monopolization and concentration that actually entrenches poverty, and I talk about that a little bit in the book. But you know, if you look if you look around, you know, most parts of the world, you will find people gardening, growing allotments, you know, even in cities, producing a bit of food, small farms, homesteads, and so on. You know, if you look around the industrial landscape, you know, you don't find you know, small car factories, you know, small local computer factories. You know, if you take any kind of industrial consumer product, you know, it is not something, by and large, you know, almost exclusively these days, you know, we're talking about a huge global supply chains and industries. Now, you know, that is also the case in agriculture. You know, there's a huge amount of monopoly concentration in agriculture, but much less than in other industrial sectors, essentially because it's harder to create economies of scale. And if we want if we want studge to be cheap, there will need to be economies of scale. You know, energy is a hugely monopolistic industry. Any type of manufacturing is hugely monopolistic. So if you're going to argue that these factories, you know, are going to be small local affairs, you know, a bit like a small farm, you need to have some argument as to why it's going to be different from any other type of industrial process. And Monbiot doesn't provide one. So, you know, in terms of the critique that that there's this kind of livestock narrative that's you know, a hidden corporate narrative, you know, that might be true, but as Jason was saying, it's really important to distinguish between different types of livestock use, and you know, the whole concept of default livestock that are actually helping to sort of oil the wheels of a small scale, low energy local economy, totally different to the logic of the global livestock industry. But yeah, you know, to my mind, it's it's a naive argument that completely plays into a sort of global monopoly of food. And then the question, exactly as you say, is who is getting to make those decisions? The other aspect of this, and it's, you know, it's a real irony in terms of Monbiot's career trajectory, is I think it's a narrative of enclosure, basically. And he's written brilliantly in the past about the dangers of enclosure and the way that ordinary people get kind of swept up and screwed over in endless ways. You know, small farmers, you know, the whole Atlantic slave trade, you know, the existing sort of trade in tropical commodities. You know, here in the UK, it's this whole debate about upland livestock farming, and rewilding, you know, which has become incredibly toxic and opposed largely because of this sense that, you know, the rewilders just want to clear, you know, the local farm communities out of the way. And also that's partly another corporate narrative about sort of carbon offsets and, you know, tree planting. So, you know, there's all of these complexities, but, you know, I think that there's a real problem with, exactly as Jason was saying, what are people going to do if they're not grounded ecologically, locally, in their local space? And, you know, we can perhaps touch on the wildlife implications of that in a moment, because I think, you know, that probably is Monbiot's strongest suit, and the issue that we do need to focus on. But there is a narrative of enclosure here, which is that it's a bit like the old narrative of enclosure here in England. People kind of said, well, if we concentrate the farms, if we make them more efficient, that's going to create work for people. There'll be hedging to do. There'll be drainage to put in. And that was sort of true up to a point for a few years before there was no work in the countryside. And that kind of led to rural underemployment and ultimately to urbanization and, you know, industrial revolution. I mean, you know, it's a bit more complex than that, but that's kind of the drift of it. And I think it's the same thing here. You know, you get the sort of rewilding argument that, oh, you know, if people stop farming, then they will be paid to be better custodians of the landscape. it's almost the opposite of enclosure. Actually, will sort of put more hedges in. Will stop draining fields. Will create wetlands. Will plant more trees. I mean, yeah, you can do that up to a point, but by definition, rewilding, it has to have some wildness in it. Ultimately, the people are sort of not incorporated into that vision. Ultimately, there's only so much work. There's only so many sort of flagship rewilding. We can't all be a NEP estate having sort of wildlife safaris to our 3,000 acres. Yeah, you can. You can have a sort of entrepreneurship around this that will create some work for some people somewhere, but not the work of potentially 2 billion small scale farmers globally. It's very much a kind of, and as you say, it's very much a sort of top down narrative of the powers that be, the movers and shakers, the urban money. I mean, I talk a little bit about the class aspects of this in the book, calling the shots. It's very much a kind of urban v rural class conflict narrative that I think is going to be enormously destructive in terms of what we need in the future. Cities are entropic black holes, as William Rees puts it. We need ruralization, therefore we need to create better, good relationships between existing rural dwellers and income. It's the exact opposite of this agricultural improver narrative, and that I think is a tremendously probably the most problematic aspect of this book. Monbiot has a chapter critiquing the rural idyll. It's just so problematic in terms of the class implications of it and the future implications in terms of a low energy, low capital society where we need more people on the land using livestock because they will have less energy available. So what we really need to have is a conversation about how we can people the countryside with low energy, low capital, small scale producers using livestock appropriately, but fitting in with with the local ecology for it to be a kind of pro-nature approach, which it can be, I think. But maybe we'll get onto that, or maybe go in another
Jason,
direction.
I want to let you go, but I want to just tell Chris one thing. Bill Rees, when he was on, was just saying the number of horses we would probably need as draft animals, and he was like, we need to start breeding these horses right now to get that. And I was like, this is so my content. I'm so here for this. But Jason, you go, and then I have other
whole interesting.
Well, I want to pick up on this a bit on this rewilding narrative. It seems like to me how I would frame what you're describing is neo-enclosure. That the rewilding narrative, at least from the eco-modernists, is neo-enclosure, meaning in order to have, instead of the agricultural improvements of enclosure of the past, it's to have the ecosystem improvement now. And we need to, in order to do this, we need to kick people off their land, and they're going to end up in the cities, right? And so, well, I guess I'm interested in if you agree that this is a neo-enclosure narrative, but two, let's go ahead and get into the rewilding part, and the fact that many of our ecosystems are at the brink. Our biodiversity, is collapsing in many parts of the world. Many animals are going extinct, and so if not the eco-modernist rewilding narrative, how do we protect these ecosystems while also re-ruralizing much of the population?
Right. So in terms of the enclosure narrative, I mean, I don't think all people arguing for rewilding, it's not always an enclosure narrative, but that is the real danger, that it becomes an argument for, it becomes a kind of opposition between wildlife and people, in which the rewilders are on the side of the wildlife, and that it doesn't necessarily, that's not going to play out the way they want, but yeah, that is a real danger. It is the case that I think we do need some areas that people pretty much leave alone. The question then is how we do that, and doing it in a way that is going to be socially sensitive and that's going to work, because if you just tell people to bugger off out somewhere, they're not necessarily gonna play ball, So so that's really important. So there was something else I was going to say about that, but it's getting to that time in the afternoon here where I'm forgetting.
Well, let me make this question a little more precise. Can agroecology and re-ruralization, what would be now this is a spreadsheet brain question, what would be the net effect of that on wildlife compared to the current status quo?
Well, I think one answer to that is nobody knows. It's and I think this is one of the problems with Monbiot's analysis, is that he kind of cites a lot of evidence to say that essentially, if you have people in a landscape, it is intrinsically bad for wildlife, and I'm not convinced. It's a very, very totalizing argument, which I don't think is well grounded in the evidence. But it does, you do start to get into these into a realm of philosophy rather than spreadsheet brain. It's like, I think, the dream of the eco-modernists is for people to be completely abstracted from nature, to be sort of godlike creatures. I mean, I quote James Rebanks, who's quite a well-known English sheep farmer who's kind of got an interesting position in all of this, but he talks about his grandfather and the way that he farmed and was sort of a creature who was implicated in the ecological drama of his farm. So he describes him as a risen ape, not a fallen angel. And I think that's kind of a useful framing, because I think we have to make ourselves protagonists in our ecological landscape. Now that will have, we will impact creatures. I mean, in that sense, we'd be like every other organism. Every organism impacts other organisms. The sort of notion that we will have no impact, that we will not be affecting other organisms, I think is this kind of manifestation of angel brain, maybe, this notion that we can abstract ourselves, and
it's also inaccurate historically, right? I mean, the idea of pristine wilderness is largely a myth. I mean, there was a recent study in Nature looking at, I forget, it was the Eastern Amazon, or it might be the Western Amazon. Anyway, showing evidence that, for at least the last 10,000 years, there's significant evidence that this is not a pristine rainforest. This is a highly human influenced rainforest, with people systematically gearing the ecology for useful crops, food, fiber, medicine, etc., not destroying the rainforest like we are now to grow feed for our cattle or whatever, but but still significantly shaping their landscape, not having no impact.
I mean, that's an important context. I mean, also there is a kind of, it is fantastically complex ecologically, and there's sort of interesting work, a really interesting book by an ecologist, William Bond, called Open Ecosystems, and his argument is that we're too focused on trees. We kind of assume that trees are good and other types of ecologies are less good, and it's kind of misled us into thinking that if you take humans out of the picture, you'll get trees everywhere. But that's not necessarily the case, because of particularly of fire regimes in more arid places, and of wild herbivores as opposed to, or wild ruminants as opposed to our domesticated ones. And that leads into some really complex terrain about which is also relevant to climate change. One of the arguments is we should get people out of the picture and plant lots of trees, or at least let trees plant themselves, and that's going to be good for climate change because the trees will be taking up carbon. It gets really complicated because there's all sorts of imponderables there about the consequences for fire regimes, the consequences for wild herbivores, the consequences for albedo. And I think this, again, going back to the spreadsheet brain point, this is where we just cannot compute this stuff. We're just like dumb humans basically, and trying to sort of
Hey, but we have
control all
AI
these
now.
parameters.
AI will figure it out.
Yeah,
So
every time
we're
we
good.
have these conversations,
let's not even start.
there's always somebody being like, well, you don't know, there's a new thing that's right on the horizon. I want to there's a new technology that we're just at the cusp of creating, and that'll actually solve it all, and blah blah blah. But I do think it's worth mentioning, or maybe as we're like moving towards the optimism part of the podcast, to just lay out in some more depth the potential vision for the positive vision. I would just say, when we're moving in that direction, we've already made the case thus far in your book and in the podcast that this isn't possible energetically, socially. There's a lot of negative impacts of the farm-free future vision. Okay, so if we accept that, we're not really going to accept this vision, what is the alternative? If we look historically, the most sustainable societies in history were sort of had this what Jason was describing, this how the Amazon was sort of a garden. The middle of the United States is a sort of managed bison population through native tribes who would do fire regimes to keep it into an open savanna, so that they would have this bison that sort of helped create this rich topsoil of the center of the United States. Like there's a web page I always like to link to, the lost forest gardens of Europe. This idea that there's a way in which you can make ecologically specific land management decisions that aren't necessarily closed canopy forest or savanna or open plains. It depends on the rainfall and the climate and all the other goals you're trying to make. The other point I would just make when we move into this direction is most of these debates, they're not incorporating almost any data from these kind of regenerative operations. They're almost exclusively including the kind of data from industrial agricultural operations. The reason they usually don't include, like a small scale, I'm thinking of Peter Allen, his operation in Wisconsin. It's multiple stacked livestock species, meant to be like a sort of savanna ecosystem, sort of managing the ecosystem, but also allowing for a lot of different wildlife to come back into the farm operation because they can sort of coexist with the livestock that are there. That kind of thing doesn't have standardized data to submit anywhere. No one's studying it, so you can't aggregate it. So part of the reason here that we can't sort of like make these global level claims to this alternative small farm future is because it's literally impossible to make standardized data on these specific ecologically specific and diverse systems, and they're meant to be diverse. They're meant to be ecologically specific.
Well, that's right, and I mean, I think that is a problem with like the livestock study that a lot of people cite to suggest the heavy ecological impact of livestock. That explicitly it talks about, it's only focuses on commercial operations, which is kind of like, what does that mean? It's and so then that kind of then sort of fuels this narrative that that all livestock are like that, and or we get caught up in these systems where in most parts of the world if you've got livestock, you have to take them to an abattoir, and then the argument is that abattoirs are these terrible, awful places. Well, they are, but you don't have that's not the only way to manage livestock, so it becomes a kind of slightly a sort of recursive debate. And as we've been saying, you can get drawn deeper and deeper and deeper down into trying to specify this stuff empirically. And Monbiot's right that we do need to care about numbers, but I argue in the book, he says we need to obsess about the numbers. But if we do, we need to obsess about them in a very, very careful way, which is not not the sort of way that you will say, I've read this meta-analysis that says we should, that this is bad, so we shouldn't do it. It's a whole other level, which, as I say, ultimately is kind of beyond comprehension, and we need to start talking about cultural realities, spiritual realities, which is to come back to your question about what the positive case is. I think it's about making ourselves ecological protagonists in our local landscapes. I don't think that's going to work if we have vast amounts of energy available to us, even if it's so-called clean energy. I mean, I live in this little off-grid homestead with solar panels. I've got an electric chainsaw. The amount of damage I can do with my renewably powered chainsaw is phenomenal. Sort of ultimately, we need to limit our energy availability. I mean, if you have no sort of generated energy available, that's a pretty tough life. So, so that's what we need to be debating. How much is enough? How much meat is enough? How much food is enough? How much energy is enough? How many chainsaws are enough? And I sort of talk about that in the end of the book. I use the concept of the keystone species. So, a lot of these very rich ecosystems that Monbiot talks about that we want to preserve are low energy ecosystems with a lot of species that are very sort of finely adapted to exploiting a little, finding their little piece of energy, their little piece in that jigsaw. Whereas keystone species, they tend to be these kind of more destructive sort of habitat engineers, beavers, elephants, and humans. We are a keystone species. We kind of blunder in there. But if keystone species that do it that do it well, beavers that have died out in the UK are being reintroduced, and everyone's very into the fact that the habitat engineering of beavers, they cut down trees, they create wetlands, that brings in other species. That's, I think, what we need to be aspiring to do. We're not going to do that if we've all got a sort of electrically powered 10-ton truck or pickup to sort of drive around our property. That's not good. That's not a sort of good habitat engineering. So we actually, we need to start talking about limits and how much is enough, and making ourselves part of the landscape. To do that, we need a bit of spreadsheet brain and a bit of number crunching, but fundamentally we need a kind of cultural narrative and a spiritual narrative about our place in the world, how we relate to each other and how we relate to plants and animals and the wider world. That's not going to happen overnight. I think this is a really long-term thing, but that, I think, is what we need to be focusing on. And within that, there is going to be a case where let's just not go. Let's just leave this part of the world. But as you say, and as Jason was saying, most parts of the world have not been left. They have got long-term human adaptations, and Monbiot wrote a book, No Man's Land, 20 odd years ago, where he talked about pastoralist peoples in East Africa and basically argued that they had been kind of belittled and demeaned by colonial narratives and sort of said to be destructive and overgrazing their livestock. But when you look more closely at what they're doing, it was very finely keyed to the local ecology, even to the extent that it benefited local wildlife. Now, I suspect he would repudiate that. I haven't heard him talk about that, but he himself was writing about that 20 years ago. But now we're in this narrative of people and nature don't mix. We have to mix. We can't not mix. If we're living in cities reach out. Whether they're using fossil energy. I mean, there's a question: can we have mega cities without fossil energy? I don't think so. But even if we could, they would. If we replace them with clean forms of energy, they would reach out in numerous destructive ways to parts of the world where the people living there have no idea what's going on. We have to have an idea about our actions. So we have to have that immediate feedback loop of, you're on your land, you're part of your community, and your farmstead, if you do something that is destructive to the natural ecosystem there, it rebounds on you. Now, it's true that there are some organisms that are of basically no real economic interest to humans. So what do we do then? That's where I think we need to build this bigger cultural narrative. And I talk a little bit about that in the book. I think in the past, people, even though they had much lower energy societies than we do now, they could be quite destructive because they had no real sense of global resources. If you read the history of whaling, people would whale out one area and then say, oh, not so many whales around here now. Let's go to California instead or whatever, So, what's good, I think, about our modern cultural sensibility is that we have this very keen sense of limited global resources, but we don't have a sense of limited local resources. Let's live in the city. Let's have more energy. Let's just make the energy clean. We don't have any real narrative about how we can limit our own individual or local or community call on global resources. And that's what we need. That's where we need to learn from past societies that they were acutely conscious of the limitations of the local ecology. And that's where we get, all of those arguments we've had before about commons and ownership models, where we need to be focusing on how we can limit our call on resources. But I don't think we do that by moving to cities, by trying to replace the existing high energy global civilization with a different global high energy civilization that just has a little less impact than fossil fuels, but doesn't actually question the underlying model. And it may be that in that process, we have negative impacts on local wildlife. I think that is a risk. I think that's less risky than the notion of, a big energy transition that is really only, it's only a theoretical one. I don't think it's going to happen anyway. And just assume that people living in cities being removed from the landscape, particularly because there's a lot of corporate interest in the landscape. You imagine if there was nobody living in rural areas, what mining companies, biofuel sort of concessionaries, sort of big destructive ranching could do. So I think we need local communities that are caring about the landscape, but that's only going to happen with a totally different economic model, not with a monopolistic sort of corporate model of food production. With a distributed local model of food production is how that's going to work. Anyway, sorry, I was off on a rant there, but that's that. I think it's that. It's not about saying, oh my God, we've got this problem now with biodiversity loss and with climate change, and then coming up with a techie solution that doesn't get to the underlying, what is causing that. The nature is trying to tell us something, and it's not trying to tell us that we should transition from fossil fuels to PV power. It's telling us something a bit deeper, and we need to, we need to listen to that and sort of think about the deeper implications, I think, and as I say, make ourselves part of those landscapes.
Chris, I have a couple of strands in my mind that are somewhat unrelated, but let me see if I can tie them into and form them into a question. I want to bring up Jason Bradford's report, "The Future is Rural," which I believe you cited in your first book, and I want to bring it up because at the end he kind of presents kind of a roadmap of how we can kind of prefigure part of this future. So he's using the adaptive cycle, panarchy adaptive cycle model of, that any kind of complex living system goes through these cycles of, rapid growth, conservation, consolidation, and then basically release or collapse. And he, and according to this model, we're kind of heading towards this kind of release or collapse stage. And so in his last chapter of this report, he talks about ways in which we can basically kind of prepare the ground for what we, I think most of us would agree is kind of going to inevitably happen with our energy availability, with our materials availability. And he has this framework of assessment and strategy. And basically the idea is that, well, and I'm going to add my own twist to this as well, this idea that we need this new cultural narrative. I hear this a lot Honestly, I'm a little bit skeptical that there's going to be like this massive enlightenment around the world, and we're all going to get this new cultural narrative, and we're all going to change. I happen to think that there's going to be these, external pressures that are going to, make it undeniable that we need to change if we want to survive. And so it's going to be a mixture of internal awakening, maybe not so much of that, but external just realities. And so, and one way that we can work with that is like, how do you, this is what he kind of goes through in this final chapter, is like, how do you prepare the ground, right? So if I'm living, I can think about my focal area, in which scale do I feel like I have some kind of agency? Maybe, and for me personally, it's my county, right? So I'm like, okay, I can be an actor, a food system actor in my county, right? I can grow some of my own food. I can meet up with other farmers. I could support farmers markets. I can engage in educational activities and workshops, and start again, not necessarily changing the global narrative, but preparing the ground for when shit hits the proverbial fan. We're a little bit on a little bit more solid grounding to make a rapid transition, right? And so I want to contrast that. You recently just wrote an article on a previous podcast we had with that I had with Gregory Landua and Daniel Schmachtenberger. So Landua, I think his view is counter to yours in the sense that he doesn't necessarily see high energy. So say we found some kind of low carbon, high energy source, fourth generation nuclear or fusion energy or something else. His view is that we need to get the incentives right, and then perhaps that energy, high energy, could be channeled towards regeneration, right? And that includes changing the monetary supply, rebasing the monetary supply in kind of ecological health. And then of course,
first of all, I'll let you continue, but easy peasy, just
easy peasy. Well, he's working really hard at it. And then Schmachtenberger comes in with the idea of multipolar traps. So if, say, my county, we decide to move towards a low energy, agroecological food system, but the county over decides that they don't want to do that, we're going to move forward with, precision fermentation and high energy, this and that, according to his analysis, they're eventually going to invade us, dominate us. We'll basically be their vassals because they have more technology, which equates to power, right? And so there's this kind of like critique of multipolar traps, but then there's this Bradford view of the adaptive cycle and collapse, which is going to be happening everywhere, but not uniformly. And so the places where it happens more slowly might get more power to dominate the rest. And then there's a Landua view of like bending potential high energy towards regeneration. And so I know that this is a big jumble. And by the way, you really should go on Gregory Landua's podcast. He invited you, and I'll be very disappointed if you don't go on. So please go on to his podcast.
Good to see that. Those two different worldviews.
So I just spewed a whole bunch of stuff at you, and I'm counting on you to kind of very neatly sort it out for us.
You have such faith in me. I'm touched. Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. Your opening thing was skepticism about the idea of some big sort of cultural awakening, and I agree with that. I'm not sort of, I'm not arguing for some kind of idealist. Let's all sort of sit around in a big circle holding hands, and then magically the right culture will be in place. I think what will happen is kind of the processes that you suggested. I mean, I think we are hitting, we're going to hit huge climate and energy crunches, and there's a whole kind of geopolitics around this. Like who has the energy? If you look at sort of the US, Western Europe, Russia, China, India, you sort of need to figure in that sort of lumpy conflict sort of stuff. So the reality, I think, is it is going to be on various scales what you just said about the counties. I agree with that sort of narrative that we can all be having our lovely small holdings and be at one with nature, but there's going to be people next door, or more to the point, I think it's not so much what happens in the next county as what is happening in Washington, D.C. or London or Moscow. You know, it is centralized power that is extending its you know, its web of influence. And that sort of, by the way, is you know, that is the problem, I think, with, you know, with that narrative that we can, you know, partly it's a problem with the energy narrative and with the sort of narrative that we can you know, we can turn all this to regeneration, we can pass the right laws. I mean, I guess I have become increasingly skeptical of kind of centralized political power in all its forms as having the right kind of structures or capacities to solve any of these problems. But it's going to be there, you know, we can't wish it away. So the issue is, how do you, in your homestead or in your county, how can you orient, you know, how can you sort of duck and weave? You know, you're not going to be able to go to Washington, D.C. and sit in a road and change it. I've tried that, didn't work. But so, you know, how can we sort of orient our local systems in ways that can survive? I think you know, the argument that, well, you can't do that, so you need these kind of big systems, big energy, big politics. You know, you end up just getting sucked into that, you know, into the maw of the of the machine. And I, you know, that's where I take issue with the kind of, you know, if the machine has clean energy available, you know, if we elect the right people, you know, that I don't see it working that way. I kind of see it, I suppose, emerging out of crisis, which is kind of what you said. You know, I think we will be moving into a world where big cities, you know, they will exert their pull as much as they can and create an awful lot of destruction, but ultimately are not going to be sustainable. You know, people will be moving, you know, one way or another, people will be moving to areas where they can sort of lead the best life possible. That's either going to be cities close to the center of power, but more importantly, I think it's going to be rural areas. And, you know, how that shakes out long term, you know, I have no idea, but that is the kind of cultural narratives that we need to be building towards long term. So I think what I'm saying is, I agree with Jason's take that, you know, we need to kind of, however we can, prepare and prefigure that. And I think that's partly about having, you know, a lot of the really interesting conversations you guys have had and that I see on Twitter about, you know, how does local politics fit into that? What about land ownership, commons, you know, issues about family and households? You know, that's sort of that's the only way we can prefigure it. But, you know, we also need to be having this conversation about producing enough but not too much. You know, the problem with the global system that George articulates, you know, he articulates the problem, but I don't think he sees that, you know, this underlying problem is the energy surfeit and the overproduction of agriculture. So we need to be asking, you know, how much do I need for myself, my family, my community? You know, I don't have an answer to how you then negate centralized power, or you know, I talk about that at the end of the book in terms of keystone species, where I think whenever you have a kind of more powerful energy force that pulls everything to it, that's true in ecology, it's true in kind of human society. So that, you know, the best thing, you know, going back to some of these older social forms that I think both of you referred to at different points, is, you know, a lot of these societies, well, not a lot, some societies, a few societies historically, they saw the writing on the wall with centralized states, with centralized power, and they did what they could to diffuse that. You know, having a party, having a carnival, burn the capital, you know, move away from where centralized power works. You know, it's hard to do that in the contemporary world, but I think the energy resource available will be diminishing. You know, states won't be able to reach out as much in future in the ways that they have been accustomed to reaching out. You know, that opens up a whole scary playbook all sorts of other, equally, if not more problematic forms of society. But it does create opportunities. That's where we have to, work together with each other and build this cultural narrative, which I think cannot be a cultural narrative of technological overcoming, of obsessing about numbers, of solving problems at a sort of macro scale. It has to be about solving problems, from the bottom up locally and connecting more widely with people. And that's where, there are sort of cultural and spiritual traditions that I think we need to start exercising again to engage with that. So I don't know if that properly answers your question. I think there is no answer to it, Jason.
Well, I mean,
it's
the question of the podcast, really. I mean, we're just trying to figure it out as we go along. But I would just briefly add a story as we're wrapping up. Just as my article was coming out, I was getting messages from friends here in Uruguay that the World Bank is getting influenced by some Dutch policymakers to use a financial instrument here in Uruguay to try to close the smallest ranches for methane reduction, quote unquote methane reduction for those listening. And, all the smallest and most sustainable, most regenerative ranches are, sending messages to each other, trying to figure out how true this is or how enforceable it will be. And I was telling somebody about this on Twitter, and they said, well, if they just had a more global point of view, then they could have prevented this. And I'm like, that's not how that works. It's not that they just needed to take the global perspective, and then these small scale Uruguayan ranchers would be able to take on the powers that be. It's just one of those things where, there's going to be this authoritarian push. It's in the name of the environment. And the part of the reason we're having this conversation is we don't want to be making these anti-environment, anti-human, best stewards of the earth policies in the name of the environment. And I think that's partially what's going on with the farm-free argument. Whether or not we'll be successful in a decentralized way, I just think there's no other real alternative to trying to gain our power by being, decentralized and having power, amongst our communities, and maybe being separate from the system and not dependent on it. I think it's the best option we have, really. So any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Well, we didn't touch on methane. I talk quite a bit about methane and livestock in the book, and it's sort of, increasingly I'm coming to that sort of conclusion that you've made, that there are a lot of these technologies of prevarication that essentially are trying to buy us a little bit of time to carry on living the way that we are. So if we cut ruminant livestock, it doesn't necessarily even mean that we will end up producing less methane, but we might do. And that potentially would be a good thing if it bought us some time to actually fundamentally restructure the way we organize things. But and the same with tree planting, lots of inappropriate tree planting going on. But the problem is it becomes this top-down solution that's let's cut a few smallholders out, plant a few trees. That will buy us a few more years of a cooler climate, and we're not actually tackling the underlying problems that are driving all of this, which in many ways is a surfeit of energy, a surfeit of centralism, a lack of ecological implication in our local environments and communities. So yeah, I agree with that. It's don't be tempted by this technology of prevarication that with just a little bit more energy, a little bit more of a techno fix that will make some environmental variable a little bit better sort of right now, that is going to be the way that we will solve these problems. We need to get out of that kind of techno solutionism mindset, and start kind of actually engaging with our localities, and essentially organizing politically against that that kind of techno fix centralist solutionist approach, which I think is ultimately the problem.
Mm-hmm.
I have one more thing. When in the discussion of appropriate technology, one thing that I'm tracking that I'm a little bit, at least not completely pessimistic about, is the cosmo-local movement of design global, manufacture local. Of course, this implies a very different ownership structure. It implies basically re-embedding markets into the commons, common kind of global information about certain appropriate technologies that can be applied locally. We see like the open source ecology project, I think, and Fab Lab movement, which is more urban based and might be problematic for various reasons. But I guess I would just add that while we don't want to gear towards techno solutionism, I think that the discussion of appropriate technology, including some that is higher tech than 16th century England, or shouldn't be out of bounds. I think that we can think through the system's implication. We could try to not completely foreclose the potential of technology, not as a large scale fix, but more as a distributed kind of tech enabler. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, I'd totally agree with that. The issue there, I think, as you said, is essentially the kind of property and ownership and sort of collective economic structures. Is what's critical there. And I know that Monbiot is kind of saying that these the studge factories are going to be this kind of distributed local option, but I think there isn't really an economic analysis in his book of how that would be the case. But I agree with you that we do need to be thinking about how to create appropriate local tech, and the key thing there is what the collective political structures around that are.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to add
a good thing about the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I want to add is, so I recently read Energy and Civilization by Vaclav Smil, and I became pretty convinced that we couldn't support current populations given pre-industrial technologies exclusively. I think he has a pretty good argument for that to be the case. And so we have no choice but to use some aspects of modernity, some aspects of technology, to basically synthesize the best of the past and the best of the present.
Sure. I mean, nothing, I mean, I know I sort of routinely get sort of accused of, wanting to sort of take us back to the Stone Age. And interestingly, Monbiot is using, he's talking about we can't solve our current problems with Neolithic agriculture. But, I think it's complicated. There was a slight conflation in what you just said, Jason, between technology and modernity that I would question, because,
right.
You can have technology, modernity, I would argue, is a more, it's more of a kind of cultural, social framing, whereas, technology is, you can have changes or improvements in technology without necessarily being sort of modern in a kind of sociological sense of the term. But yeah, I mean, I have read Schmiel's book, but I'll have to go back and read it again. I mean, I'm not. I guess I'm sort of agnostic about the energy requirements. I certainly agree. It's one hell of a problem we've got with 8 billion people on the planet living within the kind of high energy, high capital structures we have. How do we transition? How do we sort of create an energy descent pathway or a localism pathway out of that? And certainly, sort of ending existing tech or kind of energy structures at one fell swoop, is not going to be a nice way of doing that. It may be kind of what happens inevitably. So, a lot of this is about desperately trying to create a humane outcome, because if we don't embark on that path, there for sure will be inhumane outcomes. But yeah, I mean, I don't, this is not about sort of trying to recreate some some picture of the past. It's about sort of moving into the future in ways in ways that seem feasible and appropriate, and it's my opposition to manufactured food is not particularly because I dislike the idea of eating dead microbial biomass, or
I do.
It's
I do too.
Well, I mean, to be honest, there is a whole other discussion there about why are we even talking about this instead of eating legumes? Like the manufactured route is so much
Ashley hates
less
legumes.
energy efficient.
I offered to make her
legumes.
my famous lentil soup when she came, and she
I
rejected it. And so I made some cheap pasta
gross.
because she didn't want to eat my pride and joy, a special recipe.
I prefer
legumes so much.
animal-based protein.
Well,
I don't want
for you, Ashley. You either have to get to like Ashley's lentil soup, or you have to eat microbial biomass.
Yeah.
But the legumes are so much more less energy intensive than the manufactured route, and that then we get into a whole other sort of debate about why are we even talking about manufacturing this microbial stuff. It's an energy drain rather than a sort of energy positive. There's arguments about, well, people don't want to eat vegetables, they want to eat meat like stuff. This is one of Monbiot's arguments. So then we have to whole set of questions there about social status and sort of consumer ideologies and so on. So it all needs unpicking, I think, in very different ways to what he does in his book. But his book is a kind of seductive intervention in like, oh my God, we've got some big problems, haven't we? Which we certainly do. And sort of, here's my rabbit out of the hat solution. That's the problem. We need to, not only is his particular rabbit out of the hat solution problematic, but I think all rabbit out of the hat solutions are problematic, which is why we have to have this much more kind of granular debate about the kind of issues that you guys have been raising throughout all of this.
Nice. Well, I think maybe we should wrap up. This has been great, Chris. I feel like we could have, this could have gone for 10 hours. There's so many things that I'd be interested to talk about here. This is right in my wheelhouse. But I guess we should wrap up for now. But I think there's a lot more to follow up on here. And so I think it would be cool to, have more of these kinds of episodes. Digging
maybe as the book comes out, as we have people respond to it, maybe we could do a series, with responses or debates, and just keep the conversation going, because I think it's a really important one.
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk with you guys more about it. Here it is. It's quite a thin book, thinner than the last one, and it kind of, in some ways, I think, the regenesis argument is quite a good foil for the for alternative agrarian localism ones. So yeah, I'd love to talk with you about all of the issues it raises.
It would be funny if Monbiot's book was a deliberate foil, that he actually is pro agrarian localism, and so he wanted to write the book that would spur us into action.
Also, George, we'll be nice to you if you want to come on and debate on this podcast. If someone sends this to you and you're listening, please, you're invited. Open invite, and we'll go easy. We'll be civil.
I won't, but I'll be civil.
I'll be civil. You have to be civil.
Well, I'm not sure he will either. The interactions around this have been quite spicy, and I think that's one of the unfortunate things in this debate. It's good to have the eco-modernists, I think, putting that side of the argument, but not when it becomes this kind of your approach is going to kill millions. No, your approach is going to kill millions, and we sort of there's we've got a hell of a lot to do, and it's a low base to build from. And I know George has kind of said we shouldn't be divisive. I think his book is quite divisive in terms of an interview I was watching earlier. He talked about neo-peasant bullshit. I mean, that's quite divisive, because
right.
I can't see another way of going about things. So we need to somehow raise the conversation, but it's not easy.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Until next time.